In the spring of 1918, Germany stood at the precipice of history, possessing a revolutionary military doctrine that could shatter 4 years of stalemate, yet racing against an economic collapse that threatened to devour the nation from within. This is the story of the chess match that decided the fate of empires, the brilliant tactics that couldn't overcome strategic reality, and the final 100 days that changed the world forever. In my Economic and Financial History YouTube channel, where I explain how the world order was formed economically, geopolitically, and socially, this episode will tell the story of the final phase of World War I, a phase in which an incredible chess game was played. After collapsing Russia, shaken by defeats and revolution on the Eastern Front, Germany was about to make its final move to win the war on the Western Front, which would determine the fate of the conflict. Germany's time was running out. While the United States, which had entered the war in April 1917, was sending 100,000 fresh soldiers to France every month, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare had ended in failure. Germany's own economy, due to the British naval blockade, was unable to obtain the raw materials it needed. The German economy had been strained so much in terms of capacity utilization over the past 4 years that its entire industrial and logistical inventory, from production machines to locomotives, from railway lines to steel crucibles, had worn out excessively. Even the rifling inside the barrels of artillery weapons, the most important weapon of this war, had worn beyond tolerance thresholds. German soldiers, workers, and civilians were starving. When Ludendorff and Hindenburg, Germany's de facto leaders after 1916, used raw materials intended for synthetic fertilizer production to increase explosive production productivity, agricultural output collapsed. As early as the winter of 1916-1917, the German people were trying to sustain themselves by making soup from root vegetables used for animal feed. Germany had several trump cards to win the war: a 50-division superiority on the Western Front with 1 million soldiers withdrawn from the Russian front, heavy artillery individually recalibrated, Colonel Georg Bruchmüller's new artillery doctrine that would completely paralyze the enemy, Feuerwaltz, and Stosstruppen elite units tasked with infiltrating enemy lines. The new German doctrine was implemented on March 21, 1918, near San Quentin, where the British and French fronts met. The objective was to strike the junction of the British and French fronts with a sharp chisel, separate the two fronts, envelop the British armies from their southern flank, and force the British to retreat toward the logistical lines at the ports. Thus, while the British withdrew to protect their logistical lines at the ports, the French would then be struck. This was the goal of Germany's 1918 spring offensive, the Kaiserschlacht. The Germans opened by firing exactly 3,500,000 shells in 5 hours, paralyzing the British front across a 400-square-kilometer width. The Germans first subjected the enemy's command centers, assembly areas, and artillery batteries to brief but intense fire, then completely silenced these points. Artillery fire then continued with shells containing mustard gas, chlorine gas, and tear gas fired at the frontline defensive positions, while German mortar artillery also attacked enemy trenches with explosive shells. Previously, sides had spent days and weeks bombing the enemy defenses, but the Germans chose a 5-hour bombardment to increase the surprise effect. The stormtroops attacking the now paralyzed enemy trenches completely ignored resistance points, penetrating deeper through the broken enemy front, disrupting all of the enemy's organization and eliminating their ability to establish a defense line further back. The destruction of remaining resistance points on the front was left to the slower advancing regular German infantry. This was it. The Germans had discovered the doctrine that would eliminate 4 years of static trench warfare. In their first offensive near San Quentin, Operation Michael, the Germans advanced 64 kilometers in 2 weeks. The Allies not only lost approximately 254,000 soldiers, but also lost 1,300 artillery pieces and 200 tanks. Panic began among the Allies, especially the British. While the British were making plans to retreat to channel ports, believing the German offensive implemented with this new doctrine was unstoppable, the newly appointed Allied Supreme Commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch calmly pointed out that German losses were also high, approximately 240,000 soldiers, and that the German offensive had not reached a critical logistical or strategic center like Amiens on the front. The Germans saw that the defense of Hazebrouck, an important railway junction, had weakened as a result of the British front's retreat during Operation Mikhail. If this weak and strategic point could be broken with a hard hammer blow, the ports of Calais, Boulogne, and Dunkirk could now be targeted. The Germans' second blow would fall right at this point. With Operation Georgette, the Germans would inflict heavy casualties on the Allies and advance 15 kilometers between April 7th and 29th. However, Hazebrouck had not fallen. Both Allied and German losses were heavy. This time, the Germans would strike their third blow at the French front. The objective this time was to ensure with a blow towards Paris that French and British reserve units would gather from the north to the southwest to protect Paris. After the operation, the Germans planned to return north to the British front in Flanders and reach strategic points they had not reached in the first operation. The goal was not to capture Paris, but to draw British units to this critical area and then destroy the weakened British in Flanders. This operation, the Blücher-York offensive, would be directed and managed personally by the German Crown Prince, Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. On May 27, 1918, the Feuerwaltz began with exactly 4,000 heavy German guns. When French General Denis-Auguste Duchesne hesitated to abandon the Chemin des Dames ridge, recaptured in 1917 at the cost of hundreds of thousands of French soldiers, another 127,000 Allied soldiers would be expended under German artillery barrage fire. The operation was surprisingly successful for the Germans. The German armies advanced 55 kilometers in 11 days and came within 56 kilometers of Paris. American soldiers had participated in the war in meaningful numbers for the first time. Ludendorff was on the threshold of a difficult decision. He had struck 3 blows at his enemies. These blows had caused panic among the Allies. However, these blows had not yet achieved strategic success. The German strategy was to completely break the British defense in Flanders and force the British to retreat to Channel ports. At this point in the war, this objective had not been realized. The 1918 spring offensive had inflicted quite heavy casualties on the Allies, but German losses were irreplaceable. Ludendorff would try his luck once more south of Flanders. Operation Gneisenau was planned as a breakthrough operation westward over the Matz River. However, French and American resistance would limit the German advance to 14 kilometers. Subsequently, when the French launched a surprise counterattack with 4 divisions and 150 tanks, this operation would be cancelled. Ludendorff planned his 5th offensive from east of strategically important Reims toward the Marne River. The Germans, who appeared to be dangerously close to Paris, again aimed to draw British reserves from Flanders south to defend Paris and deliver the main blow in Flanders. However, the Allies had now solved the German offensive technique and had organized their defenses in depth and in echelons against the artillery barrage. Additionally, numerous mutually supporting fortified positions had been created against German infantry infiltration techniques. The Allies had air superiority over the region and observation superiority for the expected German offensive. Indeed, in this offensive, minutes before the expected German artillery barrage, the French would open artillery fire. The German offensive toward the Marne River would be easily stopped between July 15th and 18th. This time, the offensive was the French turn. French, American, British armies counterattacked the Germans, attacking the Marne with 345,000 soldiers and 478 tanks. On July 22, 1918, the Allies had won the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff had tried his luck exactly 5 times. The Germans had once again come close to Paris, but these tactical successes had exhausted all of Germany's strength. Ludendorff had proven a historical lesson once more. Offensive and tactical successes, no matter how great, are worthless if they do not achieve strategic gain. Between March and July 1918, Ludendorff had lost exactly 973,000 German soldiers and records also showed approximately 1 million German soldiers as wounded or sick. Ludendorff had found the technique to end trench warfare on the Western Front and had turned this doctrine into military success, but the price of the tactical successes achieved had been enormous losses. Now the Allies were superior not only in troop numbers, but in every way, in artillery, aircraft, and tanks. One point Ludendorff failed to fully grasp was that these successful German offensives, due to inadequate logistical capabilities, had been unable to reach the Allies' vital points. For example, what happened during the third operation, the Blücher-York offensive, was the best example of this. After the German soldiers broke through the French front, their advance strangely slowed after enemy defenses collapsed. The reason had somehow not been questioned much, yet the officers leading these units were aware of this senseless situation. After the Germans broke through the Allied front, they were devouring whatever they could find in the French countryside, which had abundant food and wine. German soldiers were being collected from wine cellars at gunpoint. These soldiers had been semi-starving for exactly 2 years. Hunger had eroded that tremendous German-Prussian discipline in German armies. Ludendorff had confused the concepts of operational success, tactical success, and strategic success, and also forgotten that magical concept called logistics, which has a vital place in strategy. Moreover, when he looked at the map in July 1918, he saw this: German offensives had achieved unprecedented success in terms of territorial gains, but as a result of these successes, the German front had a longer front consisting of large bulges, which now had to be defended with fewer soldiers and artillery. The Allies, alas, had surrendered to the Germans' new doctrine, the front line they had gained millimeter by millimeter between 1915 and 1918 at the cost of millions of casualties. Despite having spent enormous human and economic resources between 1915 and 1918, the Allies had the capacity to replace their losses. The Germans had no such opportunity. Now, on the Western Front, it was the Allies' turn to attack. Generalissimo Marshal Ferdinand Foch knew very well what to do. The 100 Days Offensive was about to begin. The opening move would begin on August 8, 1918, on the German front opposite Amiens. The British army, supported by approximately 1,000 tanks, broke through the German front. The Germans could do nothing against so many tanks. Ludendorff would record this day in his diary as the Black Day of the German army. The Allies had advanced 15 kilometers in 5 days and inflicted casualties on the Germans 5 times their own losses. From then on, the Allies would gather large numbers of tanks and artillery and push the Germans back across the entire Western Front for exactly 100 days. By September 1918, the Germans had lost all the gains of the 1918 spring offensive. In October 1918, while the French-American armies began the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the south, the British-Belgian armies began attacking eastward from Flanders. Allied Supreme Commander Marshal Foch's strategy was simple. While the Allies were conducting focused attacks on independent axes along the entire front from Flanders to Lorraine, they were advancing by cutting the lateral railway lines and railway junctions that maintained German front integrity. If a critical railway line behind the German front was cut, Germany's ability to send reinforcements along the front was also impaired. Thus, the Allies' qualitative and quantitative superiority along the entire front became even more decisive. Moreover, the Allies now had the ability to gather desired forces at any point along the entire front and attack. In October 1918, the famous Hindenburg Line was breached at multiple points. Now, while the Germans were rapidly retreating into the Belgian interior, French-American armies had reached the Alsace border. After the United States entered the war, Germany's economic situation was also quite disadvantageous. American soldiers were enthusiastic but inexperienced in both defense and offense. German artillery and machine guns
had literally mown down inexperienced Americans in 1918, but now, economically, the sides were far from equal. According to 1913 figures, while Britain, France, US had a total share in global industrial production of 51.7%, Germany, Austria's share remained at 19.2%, while Allies' energy consumption equaled 798 million tons of coal in the same year's figures. Germany, Austria consumed energy equivalent to 236 million tons. There was also a big difference in steel production output, where Germany had always been far ahead. While the Allies produced 44 million tons of steel per year, the Central Powers remained at 20 million tons. I should note that these are 1913 figures, that the Central Powers felt the naval blockade to their bones in 1918, and that industrial inventory was worn out due to excess capacity utilization.
During the war, the Allies, including Russia, mobilized 40.7 million soldiers, while the Central Powers mobilized 25 million soldiers whom they could not properly supply. The Allies, including Russia, spent a total of $57.7 billion in 1913 figures throughout the war, while the Central Powers remained at $24.7 billion equivalent. While the Allies were buying raw materials from all over the world in exchange for American dollars or British pounds and channeling them into their war industries, Germany could make secret imports through neutral Holland in exchange for gold. Let me note that this import was of insignificant volume. When the Germans requested an armistice on November 11, 1918, they had only 2.5 million soldiers left at the front. On the same date, the Allies had exactly 6.5 million soldiers reinforced with thousands of tanks and complete air superiority. When the Allies reached the Ghent-Mons-Mézières-Sedan line on November 11, 1918, all lateral railways behind the German front had been severed. Even in this state, this front was indefensible. The Allies had not only achieved dazzling victories on the Western Front, the Ottoman Empire's entire Palestine front had collapsed in the Battle of Nablus on September 19 to 21, 1918, and the entire Yildirim Army Group, except the 7th Army commanded by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, Ataturk, had been destroyed. The Turkish army could not hold in Syria either, and the 7th Army under Mustafa Kemal Pasha's command would show great heroism and prevent the enemy from entering Anatolia north of Aleppo. The line that Mustafa Kemal Pasha held in October 1918 to protect Anatolia is very close to the line where the Turkish armed forces are fighting terrorist organizations in northern Syria today. On the Iraq front, British Indian armies had reached Tikrit, and Mosul was about to fall within days. The Turkish army under Fahrettin Pasha's command was still fighting in Medina, thousands of kilometers behind the front, against the siege of superior British Arab armies. The real danger for Istanbul would come from elsewhere. The Allied army, which had been decimated by dysentery and typhus in Thessaloniki for 2 years, had captured the Balkan passes as a result of the offensive it launched against Bulgaria over the Vardar plain in September 1918. While the fall of Sofia was now a matter of time, Bulgaria would immediately request an armistice. Istanbul was defenseless against a possible Thrace offensive against Istanbul. All these developments were the reason for the ominous armistice of Mudros. Meanwhile, extraordinary events were also happening in Italy. The Italians had regrouped their armies after the Caporetto disaster and had repulsed a major Austrian offensive that began over the Piave River in June 1918. The new Italian Chief of General Staff, General Armando Diaz, was a smart man. After exactly 4 months of preparation, he would launch a tremendous offensive against the Austrians at Vittorio Veneto. In this great battle between October 24 and November 4, 1918, the Austrians would write almost 1 million soldiers into their casualty column as dead, wounded, and prisoners. This victory is Italy's greatest victory since the Roman period. Now the Austrian army had no fighting capacity left, and the road to Vienna was officially open to the Italians. The next day, the Austrians signed an armistice agreement with very harsh terms. For the Germans, this development also meant the opening of an additional southern front against them. The chain of extraordinary events continued with the order for the German Navy, anchored in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, to sail into the North Sea. This was a suicide mission. The sailors mutinied. An unnamed internal struggle had also begun in Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9, 1918. Germany had played a complete gamble with Ludendorff in March 1918, all or nothing. Kaiser Wilhelm, Hindenburg, and Ludendorff were aware of how German industrial output was declining. In 1918, Germany's industrial production was at only 57% of pre-war levels. Germany's falling agricultural output had driven the masses to starvation from the front line to behind the lines. German locomotives were too worn out to bring the enormous agricultural products and raw materials brought by the victory achieved in the East. The reason German leaders played such a huge gamble on the future of the war was clear, but this gamble resulted in an armistice agreement containing very harsh conditions signed at Compiègne on November 11, 1918. These armistice terms had been prepared personally by Ferdinand Foch. Conditions such as the Germans' immediate withdrawal to the east of the Rhine River, the immediate surrender of enormous quantities of German weapons, the occupation of the Rhineland, the internment of the German Navy in Britain, and the continuation of the naval blockade until the signing of a peace treaty were unbearable, but the Germans had no choice but to accept. These conditions, in exchange for an armistice, took away from Germany any possibility of defense, even in the weakest way. The meaning of this was as follows. Marshal Ferdinand Foch had tied the Germans' hands until a peace agreement that the Allied governments would dictate to the Germans. Indeed, the Treaty of Versailles that would later be placed before the Germans, or dictated to the Germans, would be signed thanks to the environment provided by these harsh armistice conditions. Other defeated Central Powers would face the same treatment. Generalissimo Marshal Ferdinand Foch would be seen by the German delegation only twice. First, he openly asked the Germans what they wanted and left the table without speaking. Then he prepared the armistice terms and ordered them to be placed before the Germans. 72 hours were given for the signing of the text placed before them. When the Germans signed this text of dictate nature, he personally came to the signing ceremony and watched the Germans sign the document. And so, the greatest military gambit of the modern age ended not with glory, but with an exhausted empire signing away its future in a railway car in a French forest. The tactics were brilliant, the doctrine revolutionary, but in the end, logistics, economics, and strategic vision proved more powerful than any offensive. This was the lesson written in blood across the fields of France, a lesson that would echo through every conflict to come.